in a series of presidential profiles. Millard Fillmore, 13th President of the United States.
The Constitution has made it the duty of the President to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The thoughtless and inconsiderate may be induced madly to resist such laws as they disapprove. Such persons should recollect that without law there can be no real practical liberty. The law is the only sure protection of the weak and the only efficient restraint upon the strong.
Dedicated to the constitutional principle of a government of laws, not men, Millard Fillmore was catapulted into the White House at a critical period in American history. The burning issue was slavery, a crisis which threatened to split asunder the concept of one nation. Millard Fillmore stood for the Union, rising above the divided politics and loyalties of his time. He lived to see that Union preserved. When Fillmore was born in a log cabin in New York in 1800, the newly formed United States government was only 13 years old. Although his family was extremely poor, young Millard still was able to enjoy the simple pleasures of the outdoor life during his childhood.
I had, like most boys, a great passion for hunting and fishing. When I had any spare time, I used to go down to the lake and fish and bathe in its limpid waters. It was indeed one of the clearest and most beautiful lakes which I've ever seen. The canoe seemed suspended in midair, and the fish could be seen at great depths.
Poverty forced Fillmore to forsake his formal education at an early age, but tutored by his future wife, he was able to achieve the status of both a teacher and a lawyer while still in his 20s. When he was elected to the New York State Assembly, Fillmore lost little time in putting these talents to work, repealing a law that required an oath of religious belief from courtroom witnesses. This religious reform later spread to other states and eventually embraced the entire Union.
It may be truly said that in all moral revolutions, public sentiment must precede legislative action. The representative is seldom in advance of his constituents. If you would therefore successfully attack ancient prejudices or overturn long-established errors, enlighten the people, and the work is accomplished.
In 1832, Fillmore went to Washington as a member of the House of Representatives. This star Congress, teeming with great men, was destined to produce 5 presidents, 5 vice presidents, 8 secretaries of state, and 25 governors. A distinctly American order of politics was looming up. Fillmore's backers demanded he take a firm stand on the problems confronting this young nation.
I am opposed to giving any pledges that shall deprive me hereafter of all discretionary power. If I stand pledged to a particular course of action, I cease to be a responsible agent, but become a mere machine.
After serving 4 terms as a congressman, Fillmore returned to his New York law practice, and his political career seemed forever ended when he ran for governor of that state in 1844 and was defeated. 4 years later, however, the Whig Party nominated him as vice president, and he was swept into office with President Zachary Taylor. Presiding over an unruly Senate, Vice President Fillmore established rules of decorum and dignity that mark that hallowed legislative body to this day. Then, on July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor died, and Millard Fillmore became the 13th President of the United States.
A great man has fallen among us, and the whole country is called to an occasion of unexpected, deep, and general mourning. I rely upon him who holds in his hands the destinies of all nations to endow me with the requisite strength for the task ahead.
When Millard Fillmore took office, America was on the brink of separation and civil war, brought about by the sectional fanaticism of slavery and anti-slavery forces. Although opposed to slavery, the preservation of the Union was Fillmore's prime concern.
God knows that I detest slavery, but it is an existing evil. We must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world.
Combining talents with men like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, Fillmore lent his political skills and the prestige of the presidency to the famous Compromise of 1850. Principal features of this bill included the settlement of the Texas boundary, the granting of territorial status to New Mexico, and the admittance of California to the Union as a free state. But the most important clause, and the one that was to prove Fillmore's political undoing, was the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it unlawful to aid runaway slaves.
I was not induced to recommend adherence to this series of measures because I thought those measures perfect. For no human legislation can be perfect. Why different and jarring opinions can only be reconciled by yielding something on all sides. Looking at the interest of the whole country, I felt it to be my duty to seize upon this compromise as the best that could be obtained amid conflicting interests.
Although the extremists of both sides were not pacified by the Compromise of 1850, war was averted, and Fillmore could turn his attention to the nation's expansion. There was vast work to be done in exploring the frontier of the West. Gold had been discovered in California, railroads were being built, and the magnetic telegraph was sweeping across the prairies. With the spread of America's ocean commerce, the ambitions of many citizens began to exceed this country's boundaries. Fillmore sought to cultivate the friendship of old and new nations alike, and to avoid involvement in their affairs.
Nations, like individuals in a state of nature, are equal and independent. Among the acknowledged rights of nations is that which each possesses of establishing that form of government which it may deem most conducive to the happiness and prosperity of its own citizens. Hence, it becomes an imperative duty not to interfere in the government or internal policy of other nations. The great law of morality ought to have a national as well as a personal and individual application.
In accordance with his belief in mutual respect between nations, Fillmore sent a peaceful armada of ships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry to negotiate a treaty with the Japanese government. America needed coal from Japan for its growing steamer fleets, a place to refuel these fleets, and a guarantee of the safe return of American sailors shipwrecked on Japanese islands.
We know that the ancient laws of the Japanese government do not allow foreign trade except with the Chinese and the Dutch. But as the state of the world changes and new governments are formed, it seems to be wise from time to time to make new laws. These are the only objects for which I have sent Commodore Perry with a powerful squadron to pay a visit to your Imperial Majesty. Friendship, commerce, a supply of coal and provisions, and protection for our shipwrecked people.
The treaty negotiations were successful, and Fillmore had helped mightily to usher in the modern world of commerce. But despite these achievements, Fillmore could not escape the growing resentment resulting from the 1850 Compromise. He had postponed the Civil War for 10 years and very nearly avoided it. But he had made many enemies, and his own Whig party refused to renominate him for the presidency in 1852. The Whig party shortly disappeared from the American political scene. Fillmore ran again in 1856, was defeated, and returned to his Buffalo home, where he became that city's leading citizen. He lived to see the Union preserved, but only at a cost of bloodshed he had tried to avoid. He had preached moderation and compromise, but war was inevitable.
When I was called to the executive chair, the country was unfortunately agitated from one end to the other upon the all-exciting subject of slavery. I felt it my duty to rise above every sectional prejudice and look to the welfare of the whole nation. I was compelled to overcome long-cherished prejudices and disregard party claim. But in doing this, I did no more than was done by many abler and better men than myself. When this union is dissolved, it will not be divided into two republics or two monarchies, but broken into fragments at war with each other.
Presidential profiles. Franklin Pierce, 14th President of the United States.
I believe that slavery, as it exists in different states of this union, is recognized by the Constitution. I believe that slavery stands like any other admitted right, and that the states where it exists are entitled to enforce the constitutional provision. I fervently hope that the question of slavery is at rest, and that no sectional or ambitious or fanatical excitement may again threaten the durability of our institutions or obscure the light of our prosperity.
The light of freedom had finally cast its glow over the darkness of slavery. The issue could no longer be obscured or forgotten. Franklin Pierce, through compromise, tried to ignore the course of history and failed. A frail and handsome boy during his childhood in New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce was the son of a hero of the Revolutionary War. Young Franklin attended Bowdoin College, where his friends and classmates included Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Admitted to the bar in 1827 at the age of 23, Pierce's first trial case was a miserable failure, but he was not discouraged.
I will try 999 cases if clients continue to trust me. And if I fail just as I have today, I will try the 1,000th. I shall live to argue cases in this courthouse in a manner that will mortify neither myself nor my friends.
Pierce was to achieve success as a lawyer in later life, but a political career beckoned first. With the influence of his father, now governor of New Hampshire, Pierce was elected to the state legislature. During the 1830s, he served in Washington, first as a representative, later as a senator. Throughout these years, Pierce was a silent and faithful party man, devoted to the cause of Jacksonian democracy. When the issue of slavery continued to threaten the Union, Pierce defended the constitutional rights of the South.
The Congress possesses no constitutional authority to interfere in any way with the institution of slavery in any of the states of the Union.
Needing more income, his wife in poor health, Pierce resigned his Senate seat in 1842, resuming his law practice in New Hampshire. His business prospered, and Pierce seemed to have forsaken the limelight of public life. In 1846, he declined an appointment to serve as U.S. Attorney General under President Polk.
Mr. Pierce, do you intend to accept the President's appointment?
When I resigned my seat in the Senate in 1842, I did it with the fixed purpose never again to be voluntarily separated from the family for any considerable length of time, except at the call of my country in time of war.
The call came shortly thereafter, as war was declared on Mexico. Serving under General Winfield Scott, Pierce's record was honorable, though not spectacular. Nevertheless, he returned home acclaimed as a war hero. His fame and avoidance of controversy were soon to skyrocket his career higher than he had ever dreamed. The Democratic Convention of 1852 was seeking a compromise candidate, one who would hold the party together by avoiding the slavery issue. They selected a true dark horse, Franklin Pierce, on the 49th ballot.
The nomination, relying upon an abiding devotion to the whole interest, the honor, and the glory of the whole country, but beyond and above all, upon a power superior to all human might, a power which in every crisis through which we have passed has brought out of darkness the rainbow of promise.
Promising to bury and forget the slavery question, Pierce defeated his old commander, Winfield Scott, and was elected the 14th President of the United States. But it was a promise that Franklin Pierce would be unable to keep, a bloody prelude to the Civil War which soon rocked the nation. The election of Franklin Pierce in 1852 seemed to represent approval of the principle of compromise. Pierce felt he had a mandate from the people to forget slavery and restore peace and prosperity to the nation.
It is extremely important and desirable that the agitation arising out of the issue of slavery should be finally halted for the purpose of restoring tranquility to the public mind.
Pierce's efforts to divert public attention were strenuous. He expanded trade with Japan and Canada. He tried to persuade Spain to sell Cuba. He pressured Great Britain to relinquish its holdings in Central America. He acquired land from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. Expansion and more expansion was Pierce's answer to the nation's problems.
The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of the evils of expansion. Our attitude as a nation and our position on the globe render the acquisition of certain possessions eminently important for our protection, our rights, and our peace.
But the issue of slavery could not and would not stay buried. Northerners feared expansion. They felt the Southern interests were only looking for new slave areas in Cuba, Central America, and Mexico. Passion and tempers rose. The country was a seething powder keg ready to explode. The Kansas-Nebraska Act ignited the fuse. This bill was intended to open up the Nebraska Territory for rapid settlement, but it also provided that the settlers could decide the question of slavery for themselves. They could be free or slave states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had prohibited slavery in the Nebraska Territory. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had now repealed that compromise. The South was elated. The North was enraged. The sleeping dog of slavery had been awakened.
It grieves me to observe that the spirit of concession and honorable compromise is not stronger and more prevailing. I have no apprehension that the disruption of this union is at hand, but I foresee consequences appalling in this daily use of the terms North and South as terms of antagonism.
The newly opened territory was divided into two parts, Nebraska and Kansas. It was evident that Nebraska would become a free state, but Kansas was up for grabs, and Northerners and Southerners rushed into the area to gain voting control. Both factions claimed the majority, and Pierce supported the South. Immediately, shooting broke out. Guerrilla bands roamed the area. John Brown's raid and capture became a national song, and Bleeding Kansas became a tragic symbol of what the country could expect in the years ahead. A preview of the Civil War was on exhibit. But to Franklin Pierce, the Kansas uprising had been blown out of proportion. It was only a minor disorder.
It is undeniable that many acts of disorder have been perpetrated in Kansas. But the difficulties in that territory have been greatly exaggerated for purposes of political agitation elsewhere. The number and gravity of the acts of violence have been magnified, partly by statements entirely untrue and partly by repeated accounts of the same rumors or facts.
But the implications of Bleeding Kansas were only too clear. The long-burning hopes of compromise had turned to ashes. The only recourse now was to national violence. It would come 5 years after Pierce left office. The Democrats refused to renominate Pierce in 1856. He was too controversial. They selected James Buchanan to face the rising fury of a divided nation. Franklin Pierce returned home a forgotten man. He was destined to live through the tragedy of the Civil War, convinced that the conflict would forever destroy America as a nation. The Union, said Franklin Pierce, could never survive such an ordeal.
With the Union, my best and dearest earthly hopes are entwined. Therefore, let us not encourage any section of the Union to make experiments where those experiments are fraught with fearful hazard. Let it be impressed upon all hearts that beautiful as the fabric of our Union is, no earthly power or wisdom could ever reunite its broken fragments.